everybody is allowed to have a gun. And it shouldn't be that way because some people are not responsible enough to have guns. Hey y'all, welcome to the Hickson Diaries, where we talk about my life as an American living here in the UK. About a year ago, I did a react to the details on the Dunblane massacre, which killed several children and ended up changing the UK gun laws forever for the average person. And I was commenting mainly that I think the UK gun laws are much more realistic and a better approach to society than what we have in the United States. Recently, someone who was watching that left a comment about that actually contradicted that point of view. I wanted to discuss this a little bit because I think there's some point of reflection from this comment that I know is used a lot in the US to defend the right to own guns and whatever gun you want. And so I thought it was a really important discussion to have. I hope you'll stay with me. So as someone from the UK, I can tell you that our police can only react after the fact. If there were armed civilians there, then less people would have lost their lives. A civilian with training and a firearm could have stopped the attack. Bad people will always get a hold of weapons regardless of laws. To think otherwise is stupid. What would you do if an armed person was breaking into your house? Call the police and speak to them as you're getting shot? I doubt that the robber owns their gun legally. You are your own first responder. The police will take time to get to you, take the guns from law-abiding citizens, and the bad guys rule the roost. I'm sure if you were shot because you had no means of defending yourself, your family would wish you were armed. The gun laws changed in the UK for political reasons to win votes. We can still own firearms here. We can even own an Uzi submachine here. We can own shotguns and rifles. Pistols are also allowed with extensions to their grips and barrel. If you lose the ability to defend yourself, you will never get it back. Be careful what you wish for. Bad guys who wish harm couldn't care less about guns. As an American living here, I have to say that I completely disagree with the idea of arming civilians and that makes society safer. The evidence that I know of and that I've found just does not support this claim. If you take some statistics from the United States, in fact, who, by the way, has some of the most lenient gun laws in the developed world, it suffers from this epidemic of gun violence. It is all over the country. There's mass shootings everywhere, school shootings, police shootings. These things are virtually non-existent in countries with stricter gun laws. The reality of gun violence in the US is really about numbers to me. So in 2023 alone, there were 656 mass shootings in the United States. The United States has more guns than people, with an estimated 393 million firearms in civilian hands. Every year, around 20,000 Americans are murdered with guns. And the United States is the only developed country where school shootings are a regular occurrence. In 2023, there were 346 incidents of gunfire on school grounds. As a parent who had to get the call that their child's school was locked down because of an armed gunman in the area twice, I can tell you that this is terrifying to live under. In contrast, the United Kingdom, where guns are heavily restricted for civilian purposes, has an incredibly low rate of gun homicides, just 0.2 per 100,000 people, compared to 4 per 100,000 people in the United States. Now, I wanted to talk about this because we have the same talking point in the US to defend civilians owning firearms on a mass scale. That a good guy with a gun is better than nobody with a gun. The argument that a civilian with a gun could have stopped an attack is common. It happens all the time. It's a huge talking point in the US, so I'm not surprised that it's a talking point here in the UK as well. But in real world situations, that rarely holds up. So it's a couple of years ago, there was a mass shooting in an elementary school, which is primary school, in Texas, where kids were killed because of the gunman having a semi-automatic weapon that they got legally on their 18th birthday. And the police, who completely outnumbered this one shooter, waited to go in there because they were worried about their safety. And dozens of kids got killed, to the point where their parents couldn't even identify them with their bodies. They could only identify them by the clothes and shoes they were wearing. These are police, heavily armed policemen in Texas, where there's very lenient gun laws. So I'm sure there was many civilians, parents, etc. that were watching that were armed as well. And all those children still got shot. Armed civilians almost never stop mass shooting. The FBI analyzed 160 active shooter events and found that only 3% were stopped by armed civilians, whereas 28% ended when unarmed bystanders intervened. When civilians use guns in self-defense, it often escalates the situation. Or they end up making mistakes that lead to innocent people getting shot instead. Even highly trained police officers only hit their target 30% of the time in high stress situations. So expecting an average person under that kind of stress with not nearly as much training as a police officer would have to perform better is not really a realistic expectation. The other fallacy is that criminals will get guns anyway. Look, if someone wants to commit a crime, there's very little that's going to stop them. That's true. However, this argument just ignores the fact that strict gun laws make it harder for everybody, including criminals. The UK, Australia, and Japan all drastically reduced gun violence by implementing stricter laws. In Australia, after a mass shooting in 1996, the government introduced a nationwide gun buyback plan. Since then, there have been 0 mass shootings in Australia. Having a firearm on you and in your home actually creates a false sense of security. The idea that guns makes homes safer is just completely misleading. A gun in the home is more likely to be used against the household members than it would be against an intruder. Firearms in homes just increase the risk of homicide, accidental shootings, and suicide, especially among young children. And in reality, most burglaries happen when someone's not home anyway. In my opinion, it's simply not true that the UK took guns away from citizens. As the commenter illustrated in their comment, it's still accessible. You can still get guns, but it's harder. Not everybody is allowed to have a gun, and it shouldn't be that way because some people are not responsible enough to have guns. Just like some people can't handle having a driver's license. You need to be subject to background checks, and they need to be rigorous background checks. You need to be subject to mental health screening so that you aren't going to harm yourself or someone else. You need to be checked up on that you are following all of the requirements, including safety, storage, and anything that comes along with that. Having living in the United States, I can tell you that that is something that the US desperately lacks. They have nothing like that. If they do, it's only on a state-by-state basis. It's definitely not a national mandate. And for every state that has strict regulations like that, there is at least one other state that has the exact opposite end of the spectrum and allows you to buy anything that you want almost over the counter. You consider going to Asda and being able to buy a gun while you're at Asda. Anybody can do it. The result of non-strict gun laws is a country where people constantly live in fear of mass shootings, where people constantly live in fear of their children going to school every single day, and where you fear being gunned down in the street, just walking down the street, or going to a parade, or participating in a festival or event. Because you don't know who has got a gun, you don't know what their mental state is, you don't know what they've been doing, and you don't know if someone else next to you has a gun and is going to try to defend you or themselves. At the end of the day, in my opinion, the evidence is crystal clear. More guns does not make a society safer. And if any country is proof of that, it's the United States. Part of the reason we moved here was because I didn't want to live with that pit in my stomach every single time that I say goodbye to my child every day they went to school. I know it's hard for people to understand if they have not really lived under that kind of society, but that's why there's people like me speaking out. Of course, there's people out there that are very responsible with their guns. Of course, there are people out there that use it for sport. I'm not saying that there is no reason to have guns. I'm saying civilians need to be regulated for our safety. That's why there's speed limits. That's why there's laws on when you can drink. That's why there's laws on what kind of substances you can put in your body. That's why there's laws on driving, and that's why there should be laws on guns. I'm not trying to hate on this commenter. I appreciate your point of view. I think we should have this discussion openly, and I hope that you take something from my point of view. I hope everybody has this discussion because I think it's a very important discussion to have. And I just want to say one last thing from my point of view. I knew lots of people in America that had guns and were responsible with them. And I knew lots of people who were victims or had some kind of direct contact with mass shootings and mass violence. Nobody wants it. Most people of healthy minds do not want to commit violence or do not want to see these kind of massacres and mass shootings happen. But it only takes one. And if that one person has access to a military grade weapon without any real checks or waiting periods or anything like that, that's how so many people die in a short amount of time. And that's how so many children die in these school shootings. And in my opinion, one child's life is worth more than all of the guns in the world. I don't know what you guys think. I'd be curious. Please let me know in the comments below. I know this is a bit controversial, but I really felt the need to speak out and have this discussion. Might have lost some of you on it, but I have to be honest and I have to speak my mind. I hope everybody, no matter what side you're on, is being respectful of each other's opinions and trying to have an open discussion. And I also hope that everyone who does own firearms is doing it as safely as possible. I wish you all a very safe rest of your week. Love you. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.